Hi, good evening, everyone. Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Whitechapel Gallery. My name's Richard Martin. I'm the Daskanopoulos Director of Education and Public Programs here at the Gallery, and it's my great pleasure to introduce you all to the 8th Gerrard O'Carroll Memorial Lecture. And it's wonderful to see all of you here in the auditorium, and a special welcome to those of you joining our live stream. This lecture series is named in honour of Gerrard O'Carroll, who was an architect, a writer, a curator, and senior tutor in the School of Architecture and Design at the Royal College of Art in London. The series celebrates Gerrard's ideas, energy, and legacy by inviting kindred, maverick thinkers from across disciplines to see beyond conventional assumptions and imagine our world anew. Previous speakers in the series have included the likes of Jane and Louise Wilson, Assemble, and Liam Gillick, proposing experimental and subversive approaches to human existence. This evening, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Ramon Amaro, lecturer in art and visual culture of the Global South at University College London. Ramon's writing, research, and practice emerge at the intersections of Black studies, psychopathology, digital culture, and a critique of contemporary technology. In the spirit of moving across disciplines, Ramon describes himself as an engineer, a sociologist, and a cultural theorist, and his work encompasses curation and performance alongside teaching, writing, and research. Ramon's highly anticipated book, The Black Technical Object, on machine learning and the aspiration of black being, will be published early next year by Sternberg and MIT Press. And his lecture tonight is entitled Race and the Race Towards AI, Are We Speaking the Same Language? Ramon's presentation will last around 45 minutes, and there will then be a chance for you to ask questions and to join the conversation. And if you can wait for the microphone to reach you, that would be especially appreciated so that our online audiences can also hear your contribution. I'd like to express our enormous thanks to Ramon for joining us this evening to share his ideas. And I also want to thank Adrian and Jennifer O'Carroll for their very generous support of the lecture series. And thanks also to Rosie Head for her advisory role and invaluable collaboration in developing the series. Lastly, a quick word on the COVID-related precautions that we're taking this evening. As you'll see, we're at reduced capacity to allow more room for social distancing, and if you're able to wear a face mask, we'd encourage you to do so. Thank you all so much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the evening, and please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Ramon Amaro.
Hello, everyone. Okay, if you just give me a moment, I'm just going to prepare here for just 1 second. Thank you for that very gracious introduction. And I'd also like to give a special thank you to Alice Thompson, Jane Scarth, of course, Richard Martin, and also a very, very special thanks to the O'Carroll family and friends for having me here tonight. It is a special moment, particularly in one scholarship, to be invited to give a memorial lecture and to honor someone's legacy and continued legacy and be able to engage with such critical thought and critical practice. So it really is an honor here to be here with you today. But I'd also like to thank you for taking your evening out. There's many things you could be doing, and I appreciate you spending the time with me. And finally, I would like to thank those that often aren't thanked. The tech crew, the cleaners, the porters, the ushers, all of those people that make this type of cultural production possible that don't often appear on stage or have their names spoken. So I'd like to thank you very much for that. As I'm saying, it's my pleasure to actually be at this special event to honor this memorial lecture here at Whitechapel Gallery. And what I want to speak to you about today is I was thinking about Gerrard's legacy and thinking about, the type of forward-thinking work that he was engaged in, and thinking about those moments that we often take for granted where we see the production of something, whether that's cultural production or the production of thought and the production of knowledge, and we don't often see the process, that raw, rough process that's behind the beauty that emerges. And so what I decided to show you today is the motivation behind my book. So the temptation is always to go straight into the book and to discuss the circumstances around it, and I will do a bit of that. But I wanted to show you sort of this trajectory of thought, and in many ways, this book was about 10 years in the making, and hopefully I'll explain what that means in just a moment. But before I do, I would sort of go into, despite the promises of a more responsible and equitable future, recent advances in machine learning and artificial intelligence research have, even unwittingly, widened the gap between objectivity and racial injustice. For some time, we have been seduced by notions of machine learning's usefulness in the general application of the algorithmic in our social milieu. Of course, by usefulness, I refer to the quality of assigning data a practical use value, or more so, putting data into service as a social utility, a practice that has been accelerated under the general terms of assigning quantifiable value to habitual human praxis. While in the 1950s until around the 1980s, the aims of what one might call algorithmic innovation was organized primarily around the act of play. As the great and later shamed father of AI, Marvin Minsky, proclaimed before his death, these aims, perhaps prescient from a type of Marxist point of view, so Marx is in the room, we can chat later, quickly matured from an individual concern to development for the sake of corporate and administrative objectives, which have now infiltrated every aspect of social life, from leisure to government to administrative activities. This has all occurred while creating increasingly large gaps between individual participation for the sake of participation or praxis itself, and the development of algorithms for the sake of social organization and control. So here what I'm sort of picking up is Marvin Minsky, a few weeks actually before he died, his last actual interview, he had such a scathing review of contemporary machine learning and AI. And what he was saying is that when we were developing these things, we were we were just a bunch of geeks in a closed room, and we were just playing. And as a result, there was a new innovation every 3 days. And he's saying that the problem and the disruption of this type of creative practice has been a type of interest that has infiltrated that. And now what we see is the development of algorithmic processes for certain either commercial aims, administrative aims, and at this point, even personal aims. But nonetheless, the usefulness of algorithms, despite their publicity, their publicly tested applications, is inexplicably tied to a more expansive circulation of ideas that demonstrate our increased exhaustion with present circumstances, having extracted all perceived material and non-material value from the past. Exhausted with the present, we have instead turned towards the future to provide sufficient insight into the world around us, while holding the algorithmic as the vessel through which the body of knowledge is to be understood. Through its predictive capabilities, made possible with our assistance, the algorithmic has in effect collapsed the future into the present and the past by producing insights that can effectively learn from history and validate in the present for the purposes of predicting the future. And let's not be coy, this future time is an intoxicating opportunity for habitual extraction, newly formed hierarchies, and the recurrence of individual and collective races to power. To possess the algorithm is therefore to possess the future, whereby the spoils of the unknown can be predicted, collected, and organized under the familiar guise of technological innovation. These collective consequences are obvious. We've seen these before. However, it still remains an individual and collective question. This is important because on the one hand, the engineer, as we know, seeks to position the algorithmic as the precise set of rules specifying how to solve social problems that we somehow imagine have left us behind. Yet, on the other hand, the so-called problem in itself, from which the algorithm draws its usefulness, is dependent upon the initial reduction of the historical difficulties we have encountered in attempts to resolve these same issues. It is within reason that the engineer might shudder at this claim. I'll chat with you later. I was in your room. I'm one too, so I'll chat. As there's a certain facticity to algorithmic design that makes explicit that there are and will always be contingencies within any algorithmic process, which means something or someone will be left behind. And in many cases, this is the exact point, to reduce a possible event or occurrence, which we humans like to leave to chance, and instead put the algorithmic to work alongside humans for a particular purpose or use as designated. This is what we call optimization or efficiency, or a series of actions towards the skillful removal of waste, whether that waste be time, effort, immigrant, benefit cheat, or national enemy. Pick a time and a place, and the algorithmic can help collate and identify that which is seen as waste or entropy, and feed these knowledges back to humans as insights into a future removed from this designated problem. This is not to say that this type of knowledge building is without collective value. In our present moment, many of us are invested in a future free of deadly viruses and contaminants, free of cancers, poverties, and other inequitabilities. There are computational processes that help us imagine with part hope and part belief certainty that we may be rid of these phenomena. In this way, the deployment of algorithms as aids to the process of individual and collective well-being is not without its benefits. Neither is it without its deficits. Yet it is also not mutually exclusive of any potential for individual or collective harm. Algorithms are, as the cliche goes, two sides of the same coin, where we are increasingly unable to perform our own risk assessments as we are increasingly uncertain of any potential harm or disparity might be worth the ascribed benefits. And it's here I sort of want to build into what I want to introduce you to in a moment. And now that I've discussed this sort of wider context of the algorithmic and the wider context of what we do with that which we consider waste within our society, which we know at any given moment amplifies itself into a different body, into a different ideal, into a different being, right? So the immigrant just becomes the blank. And we sort of think about how we then predict the future based on these very superficial type of attributes. But before I discuss this, I want to introduce you to someone else. This is Yumi. Yumi is the lead singer of the Chicago punk band, The Breathing Light. Although Yumi and I have only met as interviewer and interviewee, they are very dear to me because our interview bookends what is now nearly a decade of research on race and digital culture, or one area of what we might call more broadly AI ethics. My first encounter with Yumi was via a blog post that he wrote for the Black alternative festival site Afropunk. In this post, which is an excerpt here, titled, "Being a Black Punk is like a weird feeling," Yumi wrote, "Being a Black punk is like a weird feeling. To be more specific, it's like weird." I'm being gentle. It's weird when you are at a show and some of your white friends invited you to, but you really can't tell if some of the bands on the bill are white power. It's weird when you are at a white power punk show, but the only reason they don't F you up is because you are punk first, which magically erases your color. It's weird being Black and alone in a place where the freedom to be racist and effed up is granted without thought. Despite the apparent angst in Yumi's description of the Chicago punk scene, Yumi's highly effectual experience seemed to extend beyond a mere account of what it's like to be a self-identified Black punk in the Midwest of America. There was something about this weirdness that Yumi described as I suspected it might be illustrative of an unreconciled anxiety within two seemingly closed and incompatible spaces, both which were mediated by race and the violences of racism. At the same time, there seemed to be a certain comfortable discomfort in Yumi's story in their focus on the experience of the space and the experience of race and racism within the environment, as opposed to what one might imagine would be the typical response, which would be rejection of punk, rejection of the punk scene, or rejection of his own racial identity or the racial identity of others, particularly given the explicit violences that occur in the environment. So in other words, Yumi didn't cancel the scene and the scene didn't cancel him. There was something here that I wanted to investigate. This quotation is provocative, but it caught my attention as I had already been thinking about the meaning of race and therefore what it means to be a racialized individual. And furthermore, what I want to talk about today is the question of whether, when it comes to race, if we are, as a collective social and technical body, are we speaking the same languages? And so I reached out to Yumi, who graciously agreed to an interview. But prior to the interview, I wanted to see if I could identify certain themes that ran through Yumi's story. So sorry, I'll push ahead. Namely, the identity attributes associated with the affective experience they described as weird, which revealed, of course, explicit racial descriptors, not to mention the less apparent descriptors of other identifiers that Yumi placed within a hierarchy, punk first, and the subsequent nullification, which is that which they love magically erases their skin color. Although I had created a loose set of conditions in which to test the hypotheses based on Yumi's experience in a highly racist and racially insensitive environment, as part of the research, Yumi was unaware of the specific topics we would discuss, or of the ultimate aims of the research itself. I wanted to meet Yumi where Yumi was. I wanted them to take me inside this process of negotiation in hopes that our interview would reveal a pathway towards a greater understanding not only of race, but of one's negotiation with identity as it comes into proximity with external factors, whether this be the environment or another individual. And so the preliminary hypothesis was bound by a couple of characteristics. One, that there is a relationship between racial identity and environment. And two, that there's a relationship between racial identity and other identifiable characteristics. And the third, of course, is depending on one's experience in this relationship, racial identity can be strengthened or nullified. And I'm going to talk about what that means in a moment. While these propositions might seem axiomatic, of course, one's relationship with racial identity would have an impact in environment. Environment would impact one's racial identity. So in a way, it's something that we already know. But what I wanted to know specifically was if these conditions held in certain controlled environments, if they were indeed a type of autopoietic system of relation, as Sylvia Wynter might describe this scenario, and if there was more to Yumi's story than what was first revealed through the data. So if we're thinking about an autopoietic system, it comes from biology with Maturana and Varela, so on and so forth, and it's a closed system of relation, and then we can imagine these little entities within this closed system of relation relating to each other. And Sylvia Wynter, Afro-Caribbean philosopher, takes this concept of autopoiesis to think about our global relationship with race, how we have a closed system of human relationships, and within that relationships are all of these sort of disparate logics of racial compatibility or incompatibility. And so I began to formulate a set of key assumptions about Yumi's narrative. One, if black plus punk plus at show equals weird, and if weird equals not subject to explanation according to a set of natural laws, then what are the natural laws of racial identity? Two, if black plus punk does not equal black, then what is black? And lastly, if black equals unknown, then how can black be represented in AI? So it's here where we start to expand the idea of race and actual racial perception within artificial intelligence itself. So I want to just take a moment to actually subject to those that aren't familiar with how data aggregation and things such as computer vision, which includes facial recognition, our CCTV, even getting into your iPhone and your cameras, right, is recognizing your face. It's actually it's a complex system that relies on rudimentary data points. So its identification of you, so it only knows you are you as opposed to you as a cat because of the distances of your facial features, the depths of your facial features, how they're organized, and how they behave. So the algorithm doesn't know a cat is a cat. Right? It knows a cat is a collection of these characteristics, which is also how it identifies race. And one of the reasons why that facial recognition is so bad at identifying racialized people actually dates back to the original development of the JPEG. And the engineers who originally had developed the JPEG developed it based on a color palette of a swimsuit model on a beach on a calendar. So the hues of that calendar are what it's most proficient at identifying. And of course, it's more sophisticated now as we go forward. So really what I'm driving towards is as the algorithmic identifies race, it identifies it based on discrete points of characteristics which most predominantly rely upon our stereotypical logics of what race is. So race is black, race is brown. It's very rudimentary. Yeah, it's like teaching your puppy to identify brown police. So how can this sophisticated technology, which has been designed and nurtured to pick up on the relationships that we have, then rely upon the most superficial characteristics to make associations with this type of behavior? And then, of course, we reinforce that type of behavior because the algorithmic is constantly reinforcing itself with our participation. So it basically says, are you black? And I say, yes. And it says, thank you, I've just learned. So I want to sort of draw back to this basic formula that's here. And what I found in the conversation with Yumi was something that was very interesting. One is what we sort of the axiomatic is, according to Yumi, yes, there is a relationship between racial identity and environment. Two, of course, that relationship between the intersection of identities and environment becomes essentially important. But here's where things got interesting, is that according to Yumi, the intersections of these identities can be used to self-regulate these environmental dependencies independent of environmental factors. And so everyone's gonna run now. They're like, this is a science talk, bye. Essentially what Yumi described is, let me give you a bit of context about Yumi. So Yumi described himself as weird. Yumi's mother was a sort of goth that grew up around the 50s and 60s, and so was an oddball. She was a non-stereotypical black woman within America. These characteristics, of course, Yumi grew up in that environment, listening to punk and hard rock, and captured an affinity for that type of music. Now, Yumi went off to an all-black college in the United States. So, and he would sneak off on the weekends to go to the punk club in Chicago. And essentially what Yumi revealed is that when Yumi was in the punk club and he was encountered white supremacy and even racist slurs, he would amplify the stereotypical characteristics of his blackness to survive the space. So he became more black. And then what would happen is when he went back to the all-black college, because he was an oddball, he would pretend that he was in the mosh pit of the punk environment, and he became more punk. And then I discovered that Yumi's not even his name. Yumi created a double that is the double that negotiates these spaces. So basically, once Yumi encounters this space, he has a full awareness of both the benefits and deficits of that characteristics of identity. He self-modulates them in terms of survival, and then it changes depending on the environment that it is. The whole thing is too intense, so he created a persona to take care of that negotiation. And I suspect that's what we all do. And so I wanted to think about how this actually would emerge. And so, of course, I am a geek, so I had a formula. Having experienced the nullification of his blackness in the environment punk, Yumi was able to amplify the characteristics of black associated with safety to achieve a better experience in environment punk. And the inverse, having experienced the nullification of his punk identity at black environment, Yumi was able to amplify the characteristics of punk associated with safety to achieve a better experience at environment black. And these have wider implications. And the wider implications is that identity is environmentally dependent, of course, but also malleable and self-regulatory. One can actually enact, as Yumi showed, a type of world-making and shape-shifting within an environment, even independent of the motivations for that shape-shifting. And two, we might be limiting ourselves, importantly, and other racially identified individuals by viewing race as a fixed and nominal category. And of course, this extends beyond the algorithmic, right? We can think about this in the political landscape, in the economic landscape, even in the functions of our everyday, even in our self-proclamations, how we actually proclaim ourselves within the category that actually becomes a deliteralized experience from ourselves. And what's left is the actual authentic I, which never either gets revealed or never even gets reconciled with the environment. And now we have a sophisticated algorithmic process that we have nurtured to have this same human perception, and then we wonder why it's racist. So really what I'm drawing to is the foundations for my book. In thinking about not just how can we respond to racial disparity within artificial intelligence, but really question the basic assumptions that say we as humans actually understand race. That we actually as individuals and collectives and how we actually co-participate in the identification of race, that actually becomes two sides to one coin, which is what the algorithmic has picked up on, right? So we actually are functioning algorithmically, right? Because we take comfort in the communities in which we associate, but by taking comfort, we actually reinforce the necessity for the community in the first place. Yeah, and then now we're in 2021. It's very rare to meet a person who doesn't proclaim their category, right? I am a... Before they even ask the question, they're basically like, stereotype me, but I have an individual thought. Which is what the algorithmic does, right? You are only you in association with your affiliation with a more universal characteristic. And so when I sought to think about this relationship within this book, really what began to happen was a development for a foundation for future research methods. And it really became a response to contemporary AI ethics within computer vision itself, because of course the most natural recourse right now in what we're seeing is this call to code race into the algorithm, as if we are actually coding the life and what it means to be a racialized individual into the algorithm itself. And then we sort of do a separate trick where we gain a certain sense of satisfaction and we thank the algorithm for having a superficial representation of who we are. So thank you, iPhone, for recognizing me. I feel seen. And what the logics actually reveal is that the process, especially for individuals from the global south, is that we have rehearsed a sociality where visibility itself becomes the expression of power. And how do we reconcile a contemporary milieu where not only power circulates by making certain individuals visible and certain individuals invisible, but power no longer has to be present because we will do it ourselves. And we take our reward, which is the recognition. And then as soon as the temptation and the adrenaline from the recognition sort of subsides, then we realize that the same logics of hierarchy and categorization still exist, and then we need another form of recognition. And so I really wanted to test out these basic assumptions within the book. I promise you, it's not all grim. This is not until it's, I promise. And I wanted to sort of test this out, and I didn't want to take for granted that racial category as an environmental factor is what it is. And so I draw upon existing literature and philosophy to think about how we have arrived at this contemporary moment where we view ourselves in the categorical, where the categorical actually becomes a replacement for our authentic human existence. And then I take that languages from philosophy and I take it into thinking about how these logics in themselves started to coexist with early statistical histories and environments and data aggregation. And really what I'm drawing upon is a history about late 16th century to the 17th century where we became obsessed with collating data about the world. And it's a very key moment because it was then that we began to think about how many women, how many men, how many soldiers, how many this, how many that, how many that. And then we began to associate certain moments of power and association with those statistical numbers. So one example was Prussian Empire. So in the Prussian Empire, before Leibniz arrived, like pre-17th century, of course, we have a collection of villages that are there. There was not a lot of data. There was a territorial border, but there wasn't a lot of data on the population within the Prussian Empire. And then they got the idea of statistics, nurtured by amateur statisticians who were collecting data on everything. And then something extraordinary happened. They said, wait, we can count. And so they enlisted all of the bishops and parishes to begin collecting data. These were called life tables. So the parishes began to collect data on number of females born, number of males born, the trajectory of how they're born, how someone died, of what illness, so on and so forth. And then something even more extraordinary happened where they said, wait a minute, our army is comprised of men. If I can tell which villages are producing the most men, then I can predict the size of my army, which means that I can send food resources to that village so they can produce more men. You see where it is? And then women just fade. Fade in the distance. So women just become support for the war effort. And then something even more extraordinary happens. They realize that if we have a book of statistics, not only do we need to keep track of the individuals that we have in this book, so this was the birth of the national number, by the way, the single number that defines you, that's taxes, food, education, everything. This is how it was born, that single identifier. And then something even messier happened, which they realized that, well, if we can count the number of soldiers that we have, that means our enemy can count the number of soldiers that we have as well. So this data becomes proprietary. That was the beginning of the black box and government secret. This is protected category. And not only this protected category, but we can assign value upon these individuals. And these sort of anecdotal things have happened in collections throughout history leading up to contemporary machine learning. And for those that don't know, early statistics and machine learning, they're shared methods. So it's impossible at this point to sort of push them apart. And the slight history of that, so we have statistics going into linear algebra, which then goes into differential calculus, which goes into a more sophisticated statistics. Statistics starts turning into its own self-learning and automation. At that point, so we're at about like the 1950s, is the development of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And then they begin to split in the 80s. So AI is here, machine learning is here. And then now it's led up to what we have today. And what I argue in the book is that it was already presupposed to segregate us into discrete categories, and it was already presupposed to actually racialize certain individuals. Because, of course, this was the same time we began to count how many colonists we have, the size of territory, all of those sort of statistics come into play. And so when I think about this in the trajectory of the book, and then I think about the historical objectification of racialized individuals, what I begin to trace in the book is how this individual actually flows through this statistical process. Not just from the beginning of the data aggregation, but how it flows through the algorithm to actually produce a certain type of output. And really what the purpose of this project is to develop a new type of hypothesis. Does that process really account for someone like Yumi, for someone like me, for someone like you? And what happens if we are to set that object free? What happens if we are to expand it into a more dynamic and malleable sense of life? Something that doesn't depend upon the old languages and tropes of categorization and languages and utterances that we know have a very sticky relationship with certain violences. So I'm not only interested in this idea of how this type of variable blackness, or what I call the black technical object in this book, circulates in social environments, but I'm concerned with how this variability might interact as data within multinodal and intuitive algorithmic frameworks. These questions and concerns, of course, underpin the book, as I said, but I want to be clear that I do not disregard the wealth of thought, research, and even scholarly literature on race and racial dynamics. It is instead an exploratory exercise in thinking about the future and whether our reliance on more linear frameworks might impact the potential to expand both our applied and pure interactions with race. But it was clear that before any conclusions could be drawn, and in leaning on this type of fragility in this research with Yumi, right, that the subject matter I have engaged in since, that I needed to continue to challenge these key set of assumptions that we as humans and algorithms observe through visual and machine perception, and observe what is actually taking place when it comes to racial identification. Are we instead prioritizing existing racial logics that presume the attribute hierarchy, as well as fixed sets of racial characteristics? And of course, here I'm talking about the development of more nonlinear systems, right? We humans like to call it empathy, we like to call it openness, we like to call it, but really what it is a break in the linear perceptual framework. It's a recognition of the break, it's a recognition of the more, which then drives one and catalyzes one to start to capture the data of the more, already in the recognition that one is incapable of capturing all. Right? That's why multiculturalism failed in the 90s, because it was an idea that if I just put two people in proximity, they'll just work it out. Right? And what we learn from that is that these ecologies that surround the individual must be engaged with and amplified and absorbed and metabolized and pushed back in order for us to reach a more equitable relation. So I wanted to sort of test these sort of assumptions. And while the book draws most heavily from the philosophical, the technical, and the historical, I have engaged in a number of other research projects that attempt to draw value from the performative, the visually aesthetic, and also the ethnographic. But why art? Today, there's an urgency within spaces of artistic theory and practice to understand the role of AI and machine learning in society, not to mention its impact on creative production. As Gollum writes, art allows us to, quote, to be manifested by transforming the world into an aesthetic phenomenon, rendering it enjoyable in spite of its inherent pain. Irving Goffman illuminates a likely framework for Yumi's even interpersonal behavior by identifying this behavior as, quote, such a system of concrete behavior involves a differentiation of activities whose integration, one with another, allows for the emergence of overall functions maintained through an equilibrium of interaction of the component activities. That's why nobody likes academics. Right? Basically, early sociology had already determined that that two structures in proximity would create a new environment and then would reach another equilibrium. But the pain to actually get to that equilibrium is what Black feminists such as Audre Lorde had said really early. It's actually a painful process that we must sit through in order to get the equilibrium there. And that's why she goes on to say that things such as guilt and things such as, as sort of resistance to deal with the problems actually disrupt that process, because the equilibrium is actually post the reconciliation. And it's here that artistic practice becomes a rich field of investigation, as it, as Gollum writes, allows us to deal with this inherent pain and allows us to transform these certain dynamics. So one project I would like to show you is a collaborative research project led as well as participated in as part of the Dutch national contribution at the 22nd International Triennale in Milan. For those that are not familiar, every 3 years, of course, the major countries around the globe come together in Milan to celebrate art and culture in their nations. Each nation is typically led by a principal or team of curators that selects, again, an additional set of artists to represent the nation at their pavilion based on a single theme. It's like Italy's like the Olympics for art, Show us what you got. The theme that year was Broken Nature, Design Takes on Human Survival, which referred to the role that design can play in restoring the relationship between man and its environment. I'm going to go there first and come back. So in 2019, I was invited to participate in the Pavilion of the Netherlands by the Het Nu Institute to address issues of race and digital culture. And I wanted to address not only the complex histories between the Netherlands and peoples of the African diaspora, but I wanted to see how various individuals would react to this space. Would their identities come through? If so, would they use this interpersonal data to try and reconcile any sensed incompatibilities between their senses of self and the environment? And this became a very important type of case study related to what I said before, because of course when we're thinking about the Netherlands, they're still reconciling their colonial history, right, as many Western European countries are doing. What's the connection to statistics that it has is the same guy that developed differential calculus along with Newton, which was Leibniz, at the same time was developing a system to allow colonial nations to better manage colonized people. So he was doing it along with math. He was basically creating a mathematical formula that will allow Western countries to control territories. And he was an audacious man. Yeah, my American accent, sorry. So he tried to sell it to the French, they didn't buy it, so he sold it to the Dutch and they bought it. And it was integral into how the Dutch slave trade and actually colonization actually processed as a systemic issue within the Netherlands. And then here I am to deal with the idea of race and digital cultures and mathematics within a national pavilion, within a space that is then celebrating this type of heritage. And really, what does that mean? So the main curators gave me the prompt of darkness. Has anyone ever spent any time in academic or education spaces in the Netherlands? Anybody? It's fascinating. It's fascinating. I kind of secretly love it, but it's terrifying because they will let you go. They're just, so basically they were like, darkness, Ramon. What am I to do with that? So basically, I took the theme of darkness and tried to think about all the relationships that I spoke before. And what was important about the National Pavilion is they were thinking through darkness as a type of cycle through light and dark. And I wanted to challenge the basal stereotype and assumptions of what we associate with a type of darkness, right? And Ishil Mbembe actually talks about this idea of black and darkness, how we've come to associate this with lack. We've come to associate this with absence. We've come to associate this with detriment, something to be danger and awareness, right? And we use it without without any type of reflection, right? So if I say Black Friday, right, everyone got tense, didn't they? When I say a black joke, everyone's like, hide the kids. And then think about when I say black man or black woman, can I actually be disassociated from those types of dynamics? So I'm thinking about this type of history. And so what I decided to do is I wanted to push against these questions. And so I put together 3 teams comprised of researchers, filmmakers, performers, theorists, and sound artists to deal with race and technology in various capacities. It was important for me not to over-determine the space. I wanted to capture their experiences from their own expressions and perspectives. And so I did what the New Institute did to me, and I went to these teams and I said, darkness. Make something. And so I let them go to see how they would reconcile that space, to see if I can replicate that experience of Yumi that can modulate his identity to come to a different reconciliation with this environment. So this is us here, looking like a band, not far from the promenade. And what we created was a series of 3 performances collectively titled Darkness as a First Act of Creation, which was performed live at the opening of the Pavilion. The 3 teams were given full control over their interventions, which resulted in 3 unique and powerful performances. The performance was held inside of a pavilion, which was designed as a cylindrical dome in complete darkness. There were 8-foot projections, which went around the sort of attempt at IMAX kind of 360 at this point. And then, of course, these were sound and video projections on this type of vertical tiling. And here's an image, of course, of the invited audience for the opening performance. And you can see some of the images projected on the walls. So I kind of want to set this scene because what I'm going to show you next is this were the images that were there. So right now I want to show you 2 excerpts from 2 performances. The first is Substantia Nigra by sound artist Kepler from Leeds here in the UK. And New York-based theorist DeForest Brown Jr., who created a video essay on life as a black man in America living in his family home. So what was interesting is that then they created independently and came together. So Kepler is in Leeds. He takes this prompt of darkness, thinking about race and digital culture, and he creates a sound piece, which is what you're going to hear a little bit of an excerpt from. He's a sound artist, so a lot of static. And at the same time, DeForest has a verbal essay, and then he also sort of designs this piece. And so what I'm going to show you in this piece becomes very interesting elements because DeForest actually presently lives in his ancestral home. And by ancestral home, what we mean is the first home that his ancestors bought when they were emancipated from slavery. And so he's trying to reconcile his life as a contemporary black man living in this home. And so what he chose to do is he films this sort of crises, and it's filmed from a perspective of a police revolver. The lens itself is smeared with the grease from a gun. The projections that you see on the wall are old family photographs that he's projecting, and then you'll see this sort of unraveling of the anxiety that unfolds. Let's see if this will play.
Industrialized by the whites, ordained and enlightened thinking. Schemed and industrialized by the whites, ordained and enlightened thinking.
And of course, Kepler is performing this live while the projections are up on the wall. course, it goes on for about 15 minutes, and it becomes more and more erratic and more incoherent and unrecognizable. The next performance was called Decolonial Vibrations. In Decolonial Vibrations, it was a set of 3 activities. So I took the prompt of darkness and created a video essay. I partnered with a then PhD student that deals with computation and the imagination, also a DJ in Southeast London, so that was convenient. And he created a soundscape to go along with the video essay. And we further commissioned one of my PhD students, Victoria McKenzie, who goes by the performance name of Amazon Prime Queen. And she listened to the soundscape and the visual representation, and she choreographed a dance to go with it. And she's taking a sort of eco-feminist perspective to this environment, and so she's actually doing a duet with the soil in the space, and I'll just show you an excerpt of that now. And then something interesting happens. Is actually what happened is, so Victoria at the time did not know about Yumi's story or my negotiation with Yumi. As far as her choreography of the performance, she actually leaves the stage and she returns as Amazon Prime Queen. And this is just an excerpt of the sort of end of her performance. She'll probably hate the fact that I showed that she lost her wig, but it's... and then it was actually extraordinary because what actually became a very somber, sort of sober reflection about race in the Netherlands actually turned into a celebration. So actually what happened is it turned into a big dance party, which we didn't anticipate. And that was a sort of very, very special moment because really what we wanted to show was that actually even through the duress of Black life, even through the violences of racism or racial subjection is livability. It is an affirmative generation of a type of life that is constantly rejuvenating and modulating and generating itself. and it becomes something more than we can capture in this type of very superficial type of characteristics. And so it was a beautiful moment that this space actually opened up. And then what happened is after the performances, we sort of all went to dinner and we had conversations about race and the performance and how weird it was and all that stuff. And so I think back to Yumi in this sense. Yumi said, they don't really look into like the whole. They don't look into Black people, but it's in them. It's like everybody has this kind of chord in them. And once you strike this chord, it's like people. They're in tune with the things that they may not have been in tune with before that chord was struck. And what I hope to continue with this research is continue to explore that chord and see what type of life and livability might exist, not only between us humans, but between us humans and the algorithmic. Thank you. I guess we'll take questions. Is that okay? Comments, elations, general dissents. I have a trap door, so you can say whatever you want. So I'm going right out that door if I have to.
Good evening.
Hi.
Thank you really very much for your talk. I have a lot of questions, but I guess I'm sorry, I'm very bad at this because I didn't Google you before the lecture. When I booked the lecture, I didn't Google you properly. So I was really interested in how your background as an engineer
Of course.
and your multidisciplinary approach to your topic, both because race studies is a multidisciplinary field, so is race code race studies or race code studies.
Absolutely.
And so is incorporating art into all that. So I'm really interested in what came out of what and how, if that's not too long for you to unravel. Thank you.
Are you just so I can be clear, are you sort of asking like which portion of my background sort of influences other portions to arrive at this method, or?
Yeah, and because I mean the mingling between philosophy and your material, the algorithm as your material is so clearly intricate that I'm really interested in how they became intricate in that way, and how do you put art in the equation, and also you teach. So I guess my question is not so clear as I would like it to be.
Yeah, I think I understand a bit, and I'll ask you if I'm answering this. So it might be worthwhile to talk about a little trajectory of my background. So I trained as a mechanical engineer. We learned equations, numbers. It was only in my final year of uni that they actually started introducing creative writing classes because they realized none of us could write. We could only write numbers and lab reports. And so then I went out in the field and worked actually as a product engineer, mostly in quality, which meant I spent most of my time reverse engineering existing designs based on sort of corporate types of problems. And what I discovered is the impossibility to speak the languages of those problems because majority of them were human driven. So the reason why brake lines aren't working is because Bob is going through a divorce. And the system, it can't process that information. So they're like, yeah, so what does that have to do with brake lines? I'm like, Bob can't cut his partner, so he's cutting the brake lines, right? And I was confronted existing by this human relationship with the technical, and then the technical relationship with this refusal. Almost, it needs to optimize this type of human contingency out of its process, right? So this is sort of precursors to these thoughts of automation. You know, automation had already been emerged, but it's with this logic and idea that either it can do better than the human or human contingency is that which we don't want. And so that's when I sort of wanted to think about how the human actually works. And so then I went to graduate school to do a master's in sociological methods. Really boring, just learned nothing but methods. But and then it's there where I started to conceptualize this idea of how these two spaces between the human and the technical behavior come together. And then that's what I formalized in my doctorate to try to explore this type of foundational research. Now, how this comes actually into play in these disparate spaces is I adopt two methods. One is Felix Guattari's method of the idea thief. And what Guattari, those are familiar with the idea thief, is what Guattari is basically saying is that our circulations of knowledge and subsequent power, they circulate in very contingent and almost dynamic ways. And so we have to resist the boundaries of these walls that says this space is exclusively this space is exclusively that space, if we are to reveal the entire social system. So he calls himself an idea thief that says he can go into a discipline and pick it and investigate it. And it's what actually Black feminism has picked up now in new materialism. That's why it's such interesting work, because they're like, at the failure of being able to reconcile feminism with Blackness, I need to turn to physics, right? So they're picking up different processes to understand. And then the second process, of course, is reverse engineering to challenge the assumptions that I know within the space. So basically, I attack them in both ways. And that's why I start with the basic assumption of reverse engineering race, reverse engineering the algorithm, identifying a method which already opens possibility, which is art, and then I look for the intersections how they come together, and then I explore the dynamics within that intersection. And then how this materializes then in teaching is it's a multinodal type of teaching, right? So currently right now I teach one course on just Black aesthetics, where we talk about how the logics of race emerged within art, right? Beauty, taste, all those things. And then I teach a third-year course called Black Poetics, and that we start to play with different conceptions, and I do the idea thief. What can we actually capture from different fields in those types of areas? Yeah, does that answers a bit? Yeah, and then I'm in contemporary art, so they let me do what I want. Yeah, so I can get away with it because they're like, that's the contemporary guy. He's like, yeah, just don't pull the fire alarm and you're good. Oh, thank you for that question. Yeah, hi.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. And I feel slightly handicapped because I don't really know what an algorithm is, although
yes.
I use the term all the time.
Yes.
And another term that you use a lot is digital culture.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about, what is the relationship between digital culture and non-digital culture? Because the examples of disruption that you used, Yumi, excuse me, and then the performances were not digital. They were in person, and it seemed in a way the idea of livability that you were coming towards at the end had very much to do with the kind of face-to-face experience that entailed a kind of mutual recognition or something like that. So, how, in your view, how deep does digital culture go into constituting our experience? Because as an older person, I feel myself slightly outside of it, whereas perhaps other people feel as though there is no real boundary between the digital and the whatever else we would call it, the human or something. So could you comment a bit about that? It's not really a question.
Sure, thank you for that. In a way, it's what I address in the last chapter of the book, in a way. If I could start with the first part of the question, which was the algorithm. So basically, we do throw this sort of term around with the algorithm and so forth. Basically, what the algorithm is a series of symbolic mathematical formulas that are put in a certain sequence to make it perform certain things. So it becomes actionable. Now, where it gets interesting and why we call it sort of a self-learning algorithm is if we put the right mathematical sequences together, we can create a loop, which means that if I stick in a picture of a cat, it will push out, and then I ask it mathematically, what do you think this is? It will push out what it thinks it is. And if it's a dog, I say, bad algorithm. And then I push it a cat again. And until after many iterations, it finally pushes off a cat, and I say, good algorithm, it's learned. So that's what I meant about the phenotypical characteristics. So it doesn't know who you are. It knows your behavior. So it knows that you live in this location. It knows that you may have taken this public transportation. It knows that you may have flown to these places. And that's how it compiles you by association. So for the cat example, it would say, okay, whiskers. So I learn what a whisker is. I learn what a cat is. But then there's a problem, right? Because cats are the only thing with whiskers. So you have to train it again, iterative, so it doesn't misrecognize, someone's great aunt with whiskers for the cat. Right? So you have to sort of be sophisticated with how it's training. So these algorithmic processes have come to sort of power many different areas within our cultural milieu. So that's what I mean about digital culture. So one example is they're used heavily now in terms of healthcare, because you can train an algorithm to actually detect the mutations of a cell, which is why it's proficient at identifying cancers before doctors are. There's a few, actually I forget the statistics, but it's a few days or a few hours it can do it before, because it can granularly detect certain areas. Now the problem comes in is because this is a set of symbolic mathematics, these tools are typically either publicly released or they come from the public. And so the same algorithm that can help a GP identify early cancer cells is the same algorithm that an insurance company can use to detect early cancer cells and deny you insurance. Right? That's what I mean, it's a double side of the coin. And it's becoming more sophisticated at being the double side of the coin. And how I'm sort of making this connection is the idea of representation, especially with race, becomes dangerous in this sense, right? Because in one sense, I want this algorithm to recognize me. Right? It's frustrating when the soap doesn't come out of the dispenser, you can't open your phone, right? However, we do know that facial recognition disproportionately identifies Black and brown people. So by training the soap dispenser to recognize Black faces, you're actually essentially training a military drone to recognize a brown person. And it's actually the inverse relationship. So when I'm in the airport as a Black man, I like the fact that facial recognition is bad because it's the only freedom I have. It's the only time I'm not being recognized. Right? The visibility is not there. So as we actually insert our representation into these systems, we encounter the double side of the coin. So that's one of the reasons why, and it's encountered on the basic, most superficial characteristics. And so that's why I kind of want to open up those spaces. Now, on the last part about thinking about the relationship to this type of digital culture is really I adopt methods from Gilbert Simondon, who basically says that, a continental philosopher, who basically says that actually that relationship that we have with technology is not a separate relationship. It is something that we as collective human bodies created. It is something that we deploy. It is something that we actually reconcile. And if we resist this idea of a separation to us, then in my view, in my argument, what it becomes is a certain level of proximity. So then I would read your case as an individual who has a further proximity than maybe someone else, which is how I view Yumi's case. That's what I'm saying, the self-modulation. He changes his proximity to all of these types of characteristics. And what Simondon is saying is that this anxiety that we feel is a product of what we've already rehearsed as human beings, which is identifying the stranger and then associating the stranger with danger or that's other. So he's basically saying we did this in the world to people in the world, and then now we're doing it with technology. It's that other, as if we didn't create it. And so that relationship. So when I mention digital culture, I'm talking about the mix of that milieu, but also the type of impossibility for us to kind of divorce ourselves from this idea. And then it becomes a wider idea, right? Because we have throughout history as human beings been attached to this idea of efficiency and optimization. And then we at the same time feel an anxiety to that efficiency and optimization. Right? Which is why we need rest days. Like, I don't want to deal with. And think about the crises we put ourselves in. Monday through Friday, you're all about efficiency and optimization. Then magically at an arbitrary time on Friday, you're like, I'm contingent. My weekend is mine. And then we reset right back into the same system. And so that's why I'm sort of in both of these spaces, seeing how we can actually set ourselves free of this anxiety to then enact a new type of relationship. Yeah. Thank you. And then if you invite me back in about 50 years, I might have a more solid answer. Part 2. But thank you for that question. Yeah. I think we have another one here.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. I wanted to ask something that I was trying to articulate to myself in my head for a while.
Probably me too.
I guess I wanted to know whether or not you can make an algorithm that's not categorical. And if it's not possible, like, so is the other piece of that is, will the algorithm always be a reflection of our like races, the sort of inherent structural racism in our society because of its categoricalness partially? Or is it possible to think about an algorithm that could be anti-racist in some way?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, I'm trying to pull up, maybe I can possibly pull up an algorithm, a rudimentary one that I can show you. So 2 questions is, yes, we're already in that experimental space. So right now there is existing work. Some of them are called general adversarial networks where the algorithm is learning to discriminate its own data mathematically. And then what happens is it becomes a 3-dimensional type of space. So basically it's becoming a bit more intuitive. So when you type in, like Google search, for example, is becoming much more intuitive because when you type in flight to Montana, it's starting to understand what you mean, right? And so so those spaces, and there's quantum computing, there's quantum algorithms. These are all still experimental, but they are becoming more proficient. The problem with race. And this is a problem not just with race, it's a problem with gender, it's a problem with homophobia, it's the problem with all those things, is that the data in which the algorithms learn from is us. And we've misconstrued that as the idea of cleaning the data from us, right? So in other words, because it's I'm just trying to pull up maybe an image of a linear regression algorithm. Because it's a series, this is a good one. Okay, give me 1 second. Can we put the screen back on for just 1 second, please? Maybe if I can, I've messed that up. Let's see if, okay, and I can't show what's on my screen, right? I think it's a mirroring problem. Okay, it's a mirroring problem, so I can't actually show you. Actually, what I'll try to do is put it in the presentation if you just give me one second. So I'm going to duplicate that. Can you tell I'm a teacher? I do this all the time. Talk amongst yourselves. I'll be right back. Okay, there we go. So this is just a rudimentary type of algorithm. You don't have to understand it, right? So how it relates to the type of data, it's just a series of mathematical functions, right, that have to be trained to learn these dynamics. The only way it's able to make these associations is because those associations already exist, right? So back in I think it was 2013, I believe, when if you typed in Barack Obama in Google search, it would, oh no, actually it's opposite, sorry. If you typed in the N word in Google search, it would show you a picture of the White House. The only way it could recognize that is if enough people called Barack Obama the N word for the algorithm to say, N word, Barack Obama lives White House, so N word must mean White House. That's how it makes the misconceptions. It's already in the relationships in which we rehearse. Right? Identify this being, identify gender, female. Gender, female associated low pay. Low pay equals female. I search for salary, low pay, right? That's how it thinks. Because we've already rehearsed these associations. And so really what I'm seeing is the problem of race and all of these type of disparities becomes almost a human problem in which what it's going to take is a radical reimagination of how we actually relate to each other. And if we can achieve that type of radical imagination, which is sort of being generous with art, because it pushes a lot of boundaries to think about the reconfiguration of these types of objects and how we imagine them. And if we can actually imagine different spaces, we might be able to break these types of associations. So will it ever go away? I don't know. I think it's as complex as saying, will we ever enter into a new relationship with what we perceive to be different than us, right? Because then it changes the association. And by the way, I failed to mention that when the algorithm learns, it's constantly learning and relearning. That's why your ads change. It's like cat lover, and then it asks you to confirm it. Because when you click on the ad, guess what you're doing? You're telling it learned properly. That's why I keep showing you more cats. But guess what? If you decide tomorrow, I'm done with cats, I'm a dog lover, guess what's going to show up? Dog lover. So if you are a racist, and we reconcile racism, it will switch as well. And that's kind of where I'm going, is how do we create these openings for it to build a new relationship and not just replicate back to us the existing violences that we're already familiar with. Yeah. Sorry. Okay.
Ramon, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We can't get through an evening on digital culture without talking about cat videos or cat pictures at some point. Ramon, I'm tempted to suggest that if we were trying to create a formula for a really fascinating talk, we could do a lot worse than work out the components of this evening, because you promised to share with us the rawness of your thought process and your creative process, but I think it's rare to have that rawness presented so compellingly. So thank you so much. And I think in the spirit of the Gerrard O'Carroll lecture series, it's wonderful to have a talk that moves across disciplines so seamlessly and presents so many fascinating and new ideas. So thank you so much. And whether you're watching at home in your living room or you're here in the auditorium, please join me in giving a very warm round of applause for Ramon Amaro. Thank you so much.
Thank you.